Years ago, innovation was a huge buzzword in the corporate world, and every company was throwing the term around without truly understanding what it meant. And when they did understand what it meant, they dropped the term quicker than a hot potato. Now, there seems to be a new buzzword out there: psychological safety. Psychological safety seems to be one of those hot ticket items right now in the corporate world, but I fear that it may meet the same fate as innovation some years down the road, like a trend that was passing by or the flavor of the month. Therefore, we felt it might be worth holding an informed discussion around psychological safety and tell you that it has always been around and that it's here to stay if you want to tap into the best talents of your team. If we begin looking at employees as people first and then employees second, we will fully appreciate the human condition and that a person's response to fear is natural. Because this response can stifle creativity in the workplace and overall well being of employees, perhaps this is an opportunity for people in the workplace to interact with one another in a different way. Welcome back to another episode of the Thought Pioneering Podcast, part of the Freedom Cast Network. I'm your host, Kyle Shiansky, and in this episode, we're going to be kicking off a three-part series regarding psychological safety and how it can impact creativity and innovation in the workplace. I won't be doing this series alone, though. I am happy to introduce Yrenaya, who brings 20 years of experience working in the human resources and learning and development space. Jane now works for one of the top leadership development companies in the world that helps clients create work environments where people thrive. Having worked with an international hotel brand, Jane brings global experience from various hotels in Canada, Bermuda, New York, United Kingdom, Abu Dhabi, and Dubai. Jane is certified in psychological safety with Lead Factor and continues to help leaders better understand the importance of the space to overall well-being and productivity. So Jane, I want to welcome you first and foremost to the Thought Pioneering Podcast. Happy to have you here.
Oh my gosh, Kyle, I am so happy to be here and to have a discussion with you about this important space. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I know I gave you just a brief introduction here, but I want to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself to the audience and to the listeners.
Yeah, well, I work in the HR and learning space for a number of years, and one of the things that I was always very passionate about is people and behavior in the workplace. I have a degree in psychology, but knew I didn't want to get into clinical psychology and became very interested in organizational development and this whole idea of keeping people happy and engaged in the workplace, particularly when it comes to affecting, business outcomes. So I did my postgrad in HR, working for a luxury hotel brand, and was afforded the opportunity to work in 6 different countries. And it was then that I began to appreciate that regardless of what part of the world that you were from, that we all have this human need to belong and contribute our best in the work that we do. So I now work for a leadership development company, love what I'm doing because I get to help organizations in different industries, help them develop cultures and work environments where people thrive. So yeah, so I'm happy to be here to talk more about this.
Absolutely. It's kind of crazy how we met. I mean, we work on the same team. So if anybody
Yeah.
looks at our LinkedIn, you'll know what company that is. But no, it was funny how when we started talking, I know you gave that presentation on psychological safety. You invited a couple of colleagues to join, and we joined, and then you called us for some feedback, and then organically this discussion came out, and about 2 months later, here we are, I would say filming, but recording a podcast on psych safety, and not only just that, but a three-part series. We as we were discussing these things, we're like, wow, this has the opportunity to fill up at least 2 hours worth of content, but let's try and break it up into three series. So a three-part
Yeah.
series. So yeah, I'm definitely happy to have you here. Our discussions have been nothing but insightful the past couple of times we've talked. I know you've been super busy flying all over the place talking about psych safety as well. So I'm very excited to have you here.
Yeah. Well, you know what, Kyle, you're just going to have to keep me in check here today because I could go on and on in different directions when it comes to this space. And so I'm going to have to rely on you to keep me in check. So,
All right, I'll do my best. so,
yeah.
so we'll go ahead and get kicked off. I know we have a list of topics, a lot of things we want to talk about. So first and foremost, what is psychological safety?
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad that we're talking about this because so many people are very kind of intimidated by the word psychological safety, particularly when you have leaders who are not psychologists or counselors, right? And yes, it is a buzzword. However, the reality is it's been around since the very first human interaction, if you really think about it, right? I love the fact that because of the events of the world, that workplaces are really focused on being more human centric, and it's here to stay. So it's really nice to see organizations really get curious about what psychological safety is and how they could, create this climate so that they can retain the best talent and also achieve their business outcomes like innovation and productivity and service. So, I'm really just glad that people are having a conversation about it. And, I look back in my career and as a human resources professional, it was always very difficult to articulate this at the business table, right? And establish a business case for why it was important to create this climate for employees. So, the fact that we now have language around it helps HR professionals and talent and learning development professionals go to the table and be able to articulate why this is important. Okay. And
Why
it's not just hard metrics.
why now though? If like
Mm,
why all of a sudden the
mhm.
push?
Yeah. Well, like I said, I just really think that COVID has really forced people to rethink their lives.
That's true.
And, the great resignation is really forcing organizations to look at retention strategies. And like customers, our employees are looking for value.
Hmm.
So, and one of the things they're looking for is an environment where they can bring their full selves to work. Okay, so it's not always going to be about money and compensation and benefits and so on. It's what is the experience going to be like for me and how does that add to my own life, right? And this whole idea of, balance of work and life, it's so integrated now.
It
Right.
is.
So it's more like work life integration. So if I'm going to spend more than 50% of my waking hours at work, it better be worth my while.
You brought up a good point with COVID. I heard the term crisis is a cradle for innovation. And
Mm,
I mean, let's call a spade a spade. COVID was a crisis globally. And you
yes.
look at cultures and how, or not just like culture, I'm talking about work cultures, but when
Yeah.
we look at organizational cultures and how if you weren't innovative before and all of a sudden you create this environment where like you don't want to challenge the status quo, all of a sudden challenging the status quo is necessary for survival. Now
Yes.
you got people are like, what do I do? Because I've been groomed not to be this way for so many years. You got people freaking out. You don't want to
Mm,
change. And I saw at the very beginning when COVID hit, I was talking to a buddy at a cigar shop. We were watching this series. Well, I was watching. I was trying to get him to watch. It was like January of 2020, and
uh-huh.
right before it really hit us, December just hit, and I saw this show on the Science Channel called Invisible Killers. It was about pandemics, and I was like, well, this is scary. And he's like,
Mm,
you got to turn that off. That's way too real. And we started thinking about, okay, this isn't good. If this happens, it's not just going to go away. And at the very beginning, we thought we heard or we saw a lot of people saying, "It's okay. We'll go work from home for 2 weeks, and then we'll come back. Just leave your stuff here. Just we'll come back
mm.
2 weeks." And I was thinking, no, this isn't going to happen.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right,
having a
right.
background in some sort of science, and then all the community that I'm around, where we have a background in science, we knew that this wasn't going to just blow over. And we saw the first resistance of this is no, it's okay. We'll be back in a couple weeks.
Right.
Just go down, hunker down, stay safe. But I made the comment to my team. I think I said I'll see y'all back. It's like March. I said I'll be surprised if we come back before October. And
Yeah.
they freaked out and they're like, "What do you
Oh,
mean?" So we had, and that's what started me thinking. I mean, honestly, podcasting was where I started that from, is because we had to figure out a different way to get content to our learners rather
mhm.
than having them come into a classroom. So that's what kickstarted the idea for me to get into podcasting. And you see how quickly things had to change, and then it's just the innovation that had to happen for you to go from one thing to the next.
Right, right. And you got me thinking, and I come from the hospitality space. And if there was any industry that got hit hard because of COVID, that's hospitality.
Mm,
I was a victim of that. I lost my job, right? Because the business wasn't there and managers were getting laid off. And we didn't know, and there was so much mystery around this. We didn't know how long this was going to last for.
right.
So now that we're coming out of it, we're trying to recover and people are leaving the industry. So there's this retention of talent in hospitality that is so important. And second of all, it's really reinventing how we serve our guests as well in the industry.
Yeah.
Contactless, and having a QR code to order your meal. So we had to really face some harsh realities that our business has changed. And so that's just as an example. And I'm sure that there are other versions in different industries that have got impacted as well by COVID and how they had to change and be creative and innovative, right, in order to stay competitive.
So when we think about psych safety, we'll jump back here, and I know we talked about how it's kind of a buzzword lately, but it shouldn't be. It should be kind of one of those things that we really take heed of. But let's talk about the definition of psychological safety.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. So, well, first of all, like I always knew deep down when I started my career in human resources that people were the center of bringing your business forward. I mean, you've got to really think about when you look at people's talents and when they bring their energy and their enthusiasm to the workplace, right? That's people. So there are a lot of definitions out there. And one of them is from Amy Edmondson, who's a Harvard Business School professor. And she defines it as a shared belief held by members of a team that the team is safe for interpersonal risk taking. Okay, interpersonal risk taking. So anytime you have groups of people interacting with each other, there's always going to be interpersonal risk taking. And we'll get into more detail about that later on when it comes to social groups. Now, Dr. Timothy Clark, and I love his definition, he's with Leader Factor, who I'm certified with, and he defines psychological safety as a condition where human beings feel first included, safe to learn, safe to contribute, then safe to challenge the status quo in that order, right? So you could see there that already this need to belong and feel included, which is the first piece that's critical in order to stay innovative. So this is this path to innovation, all without being embarrassed or fear of being embarrassed, marginalized, or punished in some way. And in fact, I've heard him define psychological safety as rewarded vulnerability.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. Now, my definition is it's kind of related, but I believe that it's a climate of high trust and belonging that enables people to contribute wholeheartedly and thrive. That's kind of my own personal definition around psychological safety.
And it's a great point too, because our last episode we talked about failure and how people, I mean, the whole premise of this podcast channel is about the fear of failure and how we make it safe to think outside the box. And you look at, and this is why we had this discussion, because we say, well, hey, psych safety plays a big factor into that. If people feel safe, they feel safe to take risks, and you're talking about the interpersonal risk, and they feel safe to take the risk. They don't fear the repercussions, because a lot of times, especially now, I mean, yeah, the job market's hot, but still it's going through that transition. If I were to take a risk and fail and I lose my job, like let's be real, that scares people. And so who wants to go, if you're already living paycheck to paycheck, who wants to go without and missing a paycheck? So people tend to play it safe, and then they just conform. They become part of the culture that they despise.
Well, and it's just the way we're wired as human beings. So when you think about the neuroscience out there and the impacts of fear and what that does to your brain, like we naturally get into this fight or flight mode. So why would I take a risk and share an idea for fear of being ridiculed or that it doesn't work out? Why would I do that? My brain is designed to help me survive, and that's to stay safe.
Yeah.
So it's almost easier, right, to just kind of say nothing. It's almost easier to just be silent. Okay. But that's not what's going to progress organizations forward if that's the climate we've created, right? Because you want to tap into the best ideas and opinions and maybe even the observations of your people that may or may not have benefit to your organization, but be a liability.
Yeah, and it really does affect teams as well, because you might have that one person. And I was actually talking to a couple of guys yesterday, and I'm hoping to have them on a future podcast. So if they listen to this, maybe they'll enjoy the plug. But they're from the military, and they are over the Houston Chamber of the Veterans Association here in Houston. And we were just having, you can the cigar shop conversations you have is always so insightful. But we were talking about this topic, and they say, on a team. And in the trenches, you see someone stick their head out of a foxhole, they get shot. They're like, the rest of the team was like, you know what? I'm not going to stick my head out of the foxhole because I might get shot. And that's what happens in the corporation. Someone goes against the grain. They have an idea. They challenge the status quo. They get taken out. The rest of the team is like, you know what? I saw what happened to that dude over there. I'm going to lay low, put my head in the sand, and just do my job. And, and then you create this culture to where people just, quote unquote, do what they're supposed to do. And that's it.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I think it's easier if people just don't say anything and maintain status quo. That's comfortable.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Yeah, you're going to stay safe. But I think we need to be better at kind of handling those threats, if you will,
Yeah.
how we perceive it. Because even if you challenge your boss, let's say, they're going to feel threat that you're challenging their status quo, their comfort. Okay, but if we can start to see that this is essential, it's essential to for the organization to move forward, to stay innovative, stay competitive, but also for your own level of engagement, so that you can feel like you're making a very meaningful contribution to the workplace.
Yeah.
I think it just makes it all that much more enjoyable for everybody to work in that environment.
And thinking about, and I know we keep saying, it's that term, we're gonna get comfortable saying psychological safety, and we'll say psych
Yeah.
safety because I mean, for me, that's I fumble over words sometimes. So
Yeah, yeah.
for psych safety's been around for a while. It's not
Yeah.
something new, and so
No,
yeah.
no. No, like again, it's been around since the first human interaction, like I mentioned. And Amy Edmondson actually came across psychological safety by accident when she was studying great teams. And what she found with the great teams is that they made more mistakes.
Mm.
So that was really confusing to her. So she dug further deep into it. And what she realized is that the great teams didn't make more mistakes, they were just more willing to talk about it. So I think that, that's what makes a healthy team, is being able to say, you know what, I messed up here and I need help to figure out how to work around this. And then for everybody to kind of contribute. I think that's a healthy team, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, so it's been around a very long time. Now, here's the challenge, right? Because when we look at organizations, the workplace, this is another place where people interact with each other. And certainly in the workplace, we always want to be viewed as competent. We
Yeah.
want to be viewed as smart, right? And and sometimes, and I've seen this happen, unfortunately, is that sometimes people change who they are just to be accepted. And I think that's really sad in my mind, right? Because they want to, that's our human need, is to be accepted. So we start to put the armor on, we start to put the face on, right? And we shield people from who we really are. And I think that's really unfortunate, because you're not benefiting from the authenticity of the talents that people bring to the team.
Well, and also, I mean, I've been in that boat. I guess I would be what you would consider to be neurodiverse ADHD.
Okay.
Every I think everyone has a form of ADHD nowadays, but at least my doctor told me it was enough to where they're like, you need to be on medication, otherwise you might lose your job, kind of thing.
Okay.
So I quit taking my medication when I switched roles because I like I like where I work now. So and I can bring my creative self to work, but there are
Mhm.
times where I felt in my in previous roles, not like previous role, but just in previous roles where I had to be, I had to fit a mold, if you will.
Yes.
And although I was able to provide creative solutions, not and we'll talk more about that, but not from the sense of like artistic creativity, but like creative problem solving. I was able
Yeah.
to bring some of that, but with it also came the baggage of being disorganized and all the stuff that comes
Hmm.
along with ADHD. So I also often felt like I had to fit this mold, and I couldn't bring my full self to work because I was, I don't know how to explain. I was like I was walking on eggshells. It's like
Right.
who
Yes.
what detail am I going to miss today that could possibly impact my
Yeah.
career or my trajectory because it was so competitive. People will just stab you in the back any chance they can get. It wasn't that bad. I'm just saying
Yes.
I'm saying a hyperbole, so just to kind of illustrate the point. But it was one of those things where I had to be perfect, and I
Yes.
didn't like that. And it, even though I liked what I did, I just felt like every day I went to work, it was a lot more stressful than it needed to be.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that we have so much attachment to how others think of us, right? And when we get so attached to that, then we start to change ourselves. And I'll tell you, like, I've worked in both psychologically safe environments and psychologically unsafe environments, working in different parts of the world. And there's a huge difference. You can take the same individual, very talented, very good at what they do, put them in those two environments, and they're going to perform very differently.
Ah, yeah, I believe that.
You know,
Yeah.
and I've worked with leaders who have said, Jane, you need to be more like this, or you need to be more like that. And once I started to do that, because I wanted to meet everyone's expectations of how I should be or what an effective leader is, I started to get clumsy. I
Hmm.
started to feel like it was so much energy to try to be something I'm not, right? And let's face it, if we are true, inherently true to our nature and showing up to work every day, being true to our nature, that's when our best will show up.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So, and, in the workplace, unfortunately, we got to really be aware of that in the workplace, because that naturally is an environment that gets us really thinking that way, right? That you have to be a certain way. And so this really challenges diversity on your team, because you want a diversity on the team, right?
Yeah, you do. I mean, you look at like how diversity of backgrounds, cultures, thought,
Mm.
how it impacts the team's ability to quote unquote break the mold. And if you just surround yourself with a bunch of people that think like you do, you're going to
Yeah.
come up with ideas that you only agree with because, and
Hmm.
sometimes that feels good for me. It's like, oh, okay, because we don't like conflict, so we don't like to push back or resistance. Like, I like that idea. Oh, I like that idea too.
Right,
A-
right.
Anytime
Yeah,
anytime we're in a brainstorming conversation or a brainstorming session and everyone agrees, I'm like, we have the wrong people in the room.
that's right.
We need to have maybe a little bit of resistance to
That's right.
say, hey, what if we tried maybe not, maybe on the selection process, maybe in the brainstorm, you want to get all the ideas out there, but when we're selecting ideas too,
Mhm.
have some diversity of thought in there, because if we all agree like, oh, these are all great ideas, we need to have somebody in there that has the backbone to say, you know what,
Yeah.
what if let's play this out. Let's how would this work in this, and really help us think critically on how this would actually work. Otherwise, we're going to implement a solution that doesn't add value to the customer or the end user, and then we just wasted all this time. And then companies are like, "Well, innovation's messy. You just waste your time." No,
Yeah.
we just did it
Yeah.
wrong. And so,
Exactly. I mean, when you have people that are all the same, what you do is you start to do either the same things that you've been doing, but just a little bit better. Like you never really challenge. I think it's important to disrupt thought. Otherwise, you become like an echo chamber,
yeah,
right? It's
yeah,
just an echo chamber of thought.
yeah. You don't
So,
want that.
yeah, I think what is also important to realize is that in the absence of conflict doesn't necessarily mean a healthy organization, right?
Interesting. Yeah. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think that if we are going to encourage people to come in and challenge each other and be open enough to share our ideas, no matter how wacky they are, I think that sometimes you're going to get disagreements. And if we can just accept that that's a natural part of the innovative and creative process, well, then let's get better at handling differences and conflict. It's not
Yeah.
about eliminating conflict altogether, but let's just get well equipped on how to talk it through. That to me is a healthy team.
And having that high trust between the team as well to have, and that's where I think that a lot of organizations may struggle is like, well we need the resistance, like, okay, we got, then they focus on, we need people that'll just come in and be the bad guy. No, you need people to come in and provide constructive criticism, or
Mm.
like, if I'm going to tell you this isn't going to work, that was one of the best pieces is that was one of the best pieces of advice. See, I told you words, that a leader gave to me a long time ago. They said, if you're going to say somebody's idea sucks, I want you to tell them why it sucks, but I also
Mm.
want you to give them constructive feedback on what you can do to improve on it. Don't just kill the idea. So
Right.
that made me think before I spoke. If I'm going to say that's a dumb idea, I'm going to say, well, what if we thought about it from this view, or what if we thought about it from that? And I wasn't trying to say like, oh, your idea sucks, but it was more of,
Mm.
have we thought about this? Asking those, or maybe not have we, but asking those open-ended questions to get the
Right.
person. And you have like this little idea ping pong where you go and hit the ball back and forth, and then you come up with like, oh, well, maybe we didn't think about that. Let's now you have a more bulletproof idea.
Exactly. And you know what's really great? The magic comes in when teams start to build off each other's
Mhm.
ideas, right? And making it safe to, oh, tell me more about that. Oh, I never saw it that way. Let's talk about that. Let's debate that. That is healthy, I believe.
Absolutely.
I believe it's healthy.
So we'll use this next topic here to transition to our second half of the episode. But why is it a focal point? Why is psych safety a focal point in the organizations?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned earlier, Kyle, I think that organizations right now are really challenged to keep their top talent. So this great resignation is really pushing organizations to look at their culture, the work experience of employees, right? Um, and again, it's like our customers, their needs and expectations are changing. So are employees. They're looking for value, and psychological safety being one of them. I think what's also important to appreciate is that when people are interacting with each other, not only from an innovative standpoint and ideas creation, right? Psych safety can help drive those great ideas and creativity. But if they're going and they're interacting with your customers, it's important that they feel psychologically safe to take those risks when they're going above and beyond for your customers. Like, again, I come from the hospitality space. So if you've got a server that just went into the kitchen and requested something from the chef and the chef yelled at them,
Mm,
right? It's going to be very hard for that server to go to the table and put on a smile.
yeah.
Like, I mean, we can't compartmentalize our feelings and our emotions. And traditionally, we've always been kind of trained to keep feelings and emotions out of the workplace. Well, quite honestly, when we talk about engagement, that's an emotional connection to the work that you do. So
Absolutely.
it's definitely, emotional and there's feelings involved.
So what does make people feel safe in the workplace then?
Yeah. So I think what's really important is to appreciate that everybody has their strengths and talents, right? And when you work with people's strengths and talents, what you're doing is you're also valuing their differences and their areas of opportunity. Okay. So we tend to have these biases around what an effective leader or top performer is. And we have to be very aware of those biases and appreciate that we all have our own authentic way to be effective. So this really affects how we treat people and consider them for promotions or opportunities, for example. So we need to stay mindful there. At the end of the day, if we're not ourselves, not being true to our nature, we won't be our best. So I think that first and foremost, we've got to accept people for their differences. The other thing too is leadership behavior. I think if there's anything that you can invest in, it's leadership capability around creating psychological safety amongst the team. And for leaders to get better at managing those behaviors on the team that don't promote psychological safety. Because if they don't get good at that and they don't hold leaders to a standard, well, then what ends up happening is your culture becomes the tolerance of your worst behavior. So I think it's really important that leaders get really good at taking notice of individuals. And also, when you're making decisions around promotions, make this a criteria. I remember a time when I went to a senior VP about a member of his team who was a senior leader, and she was so disrespectful to the people she worked with. And the one thing he said to me is, "But Jane, she's very good at her job." And I thought to myself, well, wait a second, as a leader, isn't that part of being good at your job is to have good relationships? So I think we need to get out of this mindset that being good and competent in the job that you do is not enough,
Yeah.
right? And that it's about building good relationships. It's about, sustaining and modeling the culture you want, all of those things. So I think that's a huge shift for some companies.
Yeah, and I see that a lot in organizations too, where I can go, we can go on for this. This could be
Yeah,
another episode, but
sure.
maybe it might. But you see people get promoted because they're high performers,
Right.
and yeah, there's a hyper,
Yes.
any kind of whatever. But you have high performers; they're great at what they do, and they get promoted, and then they they suck as a leader. Let's call
That's
it that.
right.
They don't manage. I'm gonna say manage people. They don't lead well. They don't lead people. They don't create that team environment, and it becomes very, I'm gonna say toxic, but it really just takes that team. It's like, wow, how did you
Yeah.
get? And then you get the people asking, well, how did you get a leadership position?
I know.
You
Yeah. And
you
I've
might
seen
have,
that myself. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
you'll have people on that team that might be like not as a high performer, good workers,
Mm,
but they would make a great leader, but they get overshadowed because someone who did really good, they hit their numbers consistently, overdid their numbers, and they're
yeah.
like, we're going to promote you to a leadership position because that's the only
Right.
way we could give you more money. And I think a
Yeah.
lot of organizations we get that backwards. where
Yeah.
you need to look at your leadership skills. Who has the leadership skills on the team? Promote them into leadership positions. Keep your high performers as high performers, pay them well. So that way, I mean, because let's be honest, sometimes they may not want to be in a leadership position. I've seen that happen too, but that paycheck is very nice
Yeah.
and they take it. And then now you have Peter's principle coming into effect.
That's right,
So
exactly. And and what's really harmful in those cases is that especially when you have, leaders that are coming in, they're not as experienced, but they're seeing this and they're modeling this, right? Because what it signals to people is that if you want to get ahead, be very good at your job, and that, the people power skills, if you will, is secondary.
yeah,
And I think it's the flip, quite honestly, because you can train people to do the job well in terms of tasks. But when it comes to things like building relationships and inspiring people and influencing them, that's very difficult to teach. So I
yeah.
believe that's what separates great leaders from good leaders, quite honestly.
And having taught both technical and soft skills as a facilitator, as a
Yes.
trainer, I can tell you that it's a lot harder to teach the soft skills. It's a lot. I want to say it's a lot harder. There's a lot more involved. I mean, you
Mm,
could swing a hammer. There's really one way to hit a nail with a hammer, right? And
right.
so there, you can teach proper fundamentals, like don't use your arm, use your wrist. Like, you can teach the fundamentals, but it's like a binary. There's a yes and a no way to doing it. When it
Yeah.
comes to soft skills, there is like a decision tree, and
Hmm.
you're kind of you're making all these decisions, these little transactions in the back of your head of like, okay, which way do I go with this? And when you go down a conversation, something happens. Okay, now I got to figure out, okay, going from there, let's branch off into this area. So I always found that teaching and absorbing soft skills was a little bit more mentally draining than it was to learn like technical skills.
Yeah, absolutely. And these soft skills, if you will, and I call them power skills, right? But these soft skills have hard impact because if you've got somebody who becomes disengaged, that's going to show up in the work that they do.
Right.
People will just deliver enough, right, to keep their job. But if you want people to be motivated and engaged, well, then we have to interact with them differently. If we want them to be more creative, we've got to interact with them differently. So as leaders, I think we don't realize the impact that we have on the work experience of our employees, and we got to be mindful there.
And I know we're going to talk about how we can create a more psychologically safe environment and on our third episode of this series. And so I'm really excited to get to that. One thing we could think about as we wrap up this episode is how can psych safety really impact creativity?
Yeah. So, if you really think about the neuroscience again around fear, okay, so that we're in this fight or flight mode, okay, and the brain again has evolved to help us survive. And when we're in this stress mode, it actually inhibits creativity, okay,
Mm,
because the body is releasing cortisol, which is the body's response to stress. So forget innovation and forget creativity if we're always in this fight or flight mode or high stress work environment. Although I do think that some level of stress is needed to keep people motivated.
yeah.
Okay. So if people are coming into work, and we're already going into work with high anxiety. I mean, like if you look at the statistics, the World Health Organization since COVID-19, they're saying that anxiety and depression has increased by 25%. So we're already going into work stressed.
Mm,
Why make work add to that?
right.
You know? So that's how it affects creativity because I'm not going to think clearly if I'm in this stress mode. Now, on the flip side of it, when there is psychological safety, you're in a calm state. It's what I call the flow state, right? The
Mhm.
learning zone, if you will. And in fact, this actually encourages more creativity when you're in this flow state. Have you ever been so relaxed that you've come across a great idea in your mind, or if you were making a really difficult decision that when you're in a calm state, the answer comes to you,
Yeah.
right? That's because you're in flow. Yeah. So if you're in this reactive, stressed out state, you're not going to reach clarity. So this is why things like meditation is very important, taking a walk, right? So get yourself to calm state because that's when you get the best ideas. And in fact, in this state, people are more empathetic as well, and they're more grateful.
And that's a good point too, because one of the things I like to reference is the writer's block when it comes to not necessarily innovation, but just being creative. And we don't mean creative in the sense of artistic, like paintings and videos and
Yes,
graphics. That is also
that's
creative
great.
too. But creativity in the sense of I need to be able to problem solve. I need to be able to think outside the box. And sometimes you have like that writer's block where you're in
Mm,
that stressed environment where there's a crunch, there's a timeline. And sometimes you can hash it out. You're like, I handle stress well. I work well under stress. But then there's those times where you have that writer's block and you take the walk or
mm.
you're in the shower, like boom, the idea hits you. We call that the aha moment, the light bulb
Yeah,
moment.
yeah.
And I always I it happened to me once. I had an idea when I was going through an escape room. Just wasn't even thinking about work. I'm like, hey, this would be great if we could do an escape room
Mm,
for leadership development. Like, we never would have thought of that. And then I got back to the office and I said, well, how do we make this work? And
yeah,
then I was like, that was a whole journey on its own. But it was just one of those things to where I wasn't even thinking about it. And then the idea was just like, what if we tried? Because that the innovation, right? I wasn't inventing something. I was taking what's already been done and then applying it in a pragmatic way to the domain that I had knowledge of. And
right.
it brought a lot of value to our learners. But you look at how I was maybe I was stressed in an escape room. Who knows?
Yeah,
But I wasn't
yeah,
stressed in the sense that I should have been stressed when thinking about how do we come up with a new way to engage leaders. I wasn't thinking
right.
about it.
Yeah, yeah. So again, you felt safe to be able to take some risk there, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. Like you don't want to stifle innovation, and I think too, when it comes to the workplace, we've got to appreciate people's levels of creativity
Hmm.
throughout times of the day. Like I know I'm most alert and creative in the morning.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or after dinner. So I think when it comes to the hybrid work model, right, we're very like, okay, you got to be at work from 9 to 5. And in the knowledge worker age, when we're trying to tap into people's minds and hearts, like we can't just switch that on, right? Like we've got to be able to have autonomy to decide when am I most creative. If I'm stumbling upon a project, I will take a break
Hmm.
because there's no point in me sitting there trying to force myself to come up with ideas. So when I go and I take a break, whether it's take a walk, I'll relax and then the ideas will come to me. And I always am more productive when I come back.
So when is Jane most creative? I'm gonna ask you that question.
Well, I'm most creative in the morning. I get up at 5:30 in the morning and my husband's still sleeping, so I've got that quiet time here in the morning to myself. So I usually do a little bit of yoga and meditation every day. And I find that when I'm doing that, I have some really thought provoking things. So I've got my phone here, and I'll type up some notes, and it just comes to me. It's not something forced, right?
Yeah.
But I do have a creative side to me. I do crafting,
Hmm.
which I haven't had much time to do lately, but I just love it because that in itself for me is meditative,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, and sometimes it depends. Sometimes I'm the most creative after dinner at night.
Hmm.
Yeah, depends.
That's awesome.
And when is Kyle most creative?
Uh, I would say around 7 p.m. Central Time.
Okay.
But I tend to be most creative at when it's dark outside, and that
Yeah.
could be at and we're in the Central Time Zone of the United States, but it could be anywhere from 8 p.m. and I've also been creative at 3 a.m. So
Okay.
yeah, it really depends. I think for me, when it's dark outside, because if it's light outside, I will. There's things I know I need to be doing outside, like mowing the yard, or like
Right.
I take the dog for a walk or whatever. But when it's dark, I tend to hunker down, and I think that comes from like my video gaming experience, where
Sure.
I play
Sure.
most of my video games when it's nighttime. And
Yeah.
so I can go on and on about how certain games have stimulated my ability to be creative, and
Yeah.
think about like good storytelling tactics, or
Mm,
not just like the first person shooter games. Like, no, I don't really play those as much anymore, but it's more of like the
mm.
story driven games.
Right.
How do you transport yourself into a different environment?
Right.
But also
Right.
for me, I looked at how I did that for my learners when I created content. So
Yeah.
I also found that very helpful for me. So maybe that's why, maybe, but yeah.
Well, and back to your point there, Kyle, about creativity. It's not necessarily artistic, if you will, like a
Hmm.
painting and so on. I think in the workplace that if you can take a problem and think of it differently, or find a way to work around, right? That's creativity. That's just challenging your mind to look at things differently and be creative.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
got to be comfortable getting out of that comfort zone. It's
Yes,
no growth in the comfort zone and no comfort in the growth zone. So,
absolutely. You're right. You're
all
right.
right. This wraps up this episode of Thought Pioneering. Next month,
Oh my God, already, Kyle?
I know it's coming in. Yeah. So what we'll do next month, I'll have Jane back here as we build off of this episode and do part 2 of this series and talk about psychological safety as it relates to individual contributors in the workplace. So you definitely don't want to miss that. If you like this episode, please feel free to smash that like button and share this podcast with your friends and family. And if you want to be notified when we launch more content from this channel, then go ahead and ring that bell icon to receive the alerts when the new episodes drop. We'll see you next time on Thought Pioneering.